When the Tafonius screen opens, you're presented with the normal Tafonius data screen, and we have in other videos and talks discussed the role of the green buttons. And in this talk we're going to discuss the role of the monitoring buttons, and by this I mean these buttons that are labelled ECG and IBP, CO2, AP, oxygen, SpO2, ISO, and the blue buttons ECG print and phases, and the nitrous button. We'll start in the top right hand corner with the ECG button. Any button when pressed brings up a configuration panel which allows you to configure the way the information for the button and its associated trace is displayed. So if we click on the ECG button, we see in the bottom of the screen now we have a configuration panel for ECG stroke IBP traces. If we look to the left at the bottom, we see it says select ECG IBP, and if I click on IBP it changes all the parameters to the IBP. If I go back to ECG, it goes back to the ECG parameters. If I close this momentarily and now click on the IBP side of that button, it opens it with the IBP already selected. If I close that and click on the ECG, it opens it with ECG selected. But it's very easy to swap between the two, as I've shown. Anyway, configuration panels follow a standard pattern. When you know one, then you more or less know the others. If we look at the left-hand side, we have information. Three buttons provide information or access to three parts of the configuration. We have the trace, which is highlighted now. We have the alarms, and we have colours. Just to show you, if I click on alarms, these show the alarm limits available for that particular trace. And if we click on colours, then we can use or set up the colours for display for that particular trace. We'll come back to these momentarily. So in the trace option, we have a sweep speed and a sensitivity. The sweep speed is in millimeters per second and is the speed at which the trace actually moves across the screen. At the moment we have a simulated ECG passing across the screen, which has a heart rate of 72. And if we change the sweep speed here to 25, we'll see that that will change and slow down on the screen. There we are. And if we even slower, put it to 12.5 millimeters per second, it becomes slower. And we can speed it right up. We can look at it 100 millimeters per second or even 200 millimeters per second, where it gets stretched right out. Typically we use this for horses at 50 or 25. The next panel across shows the sensitivity. In other words, that's how big the ECG is going to appear. And if we make it smaller by making the sensitivity less, we can see that by changing that it changes the size on the screen. The most sensitive is 1 millivolt per division, and that shows the large size on the screen. In fact, now it's so large it's gone off the scale of the screen, and we have some clipping at the bottom of the ECG. So we'll put that back to 2.5. Another useful feature is to be able to shift the trace whilst it's on the screen. So if we click here, we see in this up-down arrow button, if I click on the shift there, we're now in shift mode, and we're currently level 3. If I click up, we'll see that the ECG shifts up. Click again, and again, and it moves up, and it's going off the screen. So we'll bring that back down, there, and we'll hold it there. The other option here with this control arrows up and down are the filter. At the moment we have a filter which is a low pass filter, and I've set this up to show you what the effect of the filter does. If we take the filter off, we'll see that we have what is typically a noisy bass line. This could be because someone's clipping at the moment, clipping the horse ready, or it could be a bad connection, or it could be electrical interference, all sorts of things. But it's not too serious, and the simplest thing in these instances is to A, just check the connections and put more spirit or contact medium on, and then B, to employ a filter. And we have two filters we can use. The most common is the low pass filter. We click on that, and then we'll see that we have in blue it says filter, and we have a blue 6 because we have 6 levels of filter. If we reduce the levels of filter, we'll see that the noise becomes more and more apparent. In fact, if there's no level of filter, we're back to where we were before with no filter selected. So if you have a lot of noise, put the filter on, put it on low pass, and increase the iterations of the filter until you get a nice smooth trace like that. A low pass filter will take off all the noise and interference above a certain level, so it's a blanket cut off. The notch filter is different and will only take out mains interference. So if we click on notch now, and we're on filter level 1, we've still got some noise there. If we increase this filtering, we'll see that the noise doesn't change very much. That's because the noise that we're seeing here is not due to mains interference, it's due to some other sort of interference. So our best option in this instance is to use a low pass filter. There we go, back to that. There we are. Going down in this panel, we have a sound area where we can opt to make the ECG or the machine beep on every ECG QRS complex detected by simply clicking in this button. Setting this tick box here means that we will hear the beep for every ECG complex detected. But since there's only one loudspeaker per computer, if you select this for ECG, it'll automatically deselect it for anything else. Moving across, we have prevent double count. This is very useful when monitoring horses, particularly when they have very large spiky T waves, which often get counted as another R wave. And then you get a heart rate of 68 when really the heart rate's only 34. If you click on this tick box to prevent double count, then what happens is that the refractory time indicated below, which at this point is 600 milliseconds, means that once it detects the R wave in the QRS complex, it won't look for another one for another 600 milliseconds, which means that the following T wave, spiky T wave, will be completely ignored. If you find it's not, you can increase this, maybe put it to 800, and then you'll go back to having your single count. And this can be turned on or off at any time. That's all of the features for the trace options. And you will notice, or you may have noticed, at the top of the screen my preset K Simpson is now got a little star by it because it's been changed. And these are all part of my preset settings. So if I were to close this briefly, go into configure, go to my preset and save it, now all of those configurations are now saved as in my preset and will be that way any time I use this preset. Let's go back to the ECG configuration panel. So we saw the options of the trace. We can now put in, I'll click on the alarms button, and we only have a high and low alarm for the ECG heart rate. If we enable that, then we can set a value for our high heart rate, and we'll put a value of 90 in there. And if we want an option for our low heart rate, we'll put a value in here. We'll put a value of 30. Now, whenever these alarm limits are exceeded, the ECG trace button will flash and there'll be an audible alarm. The next button is the colours. We can use the original colours of the Tafonius system. If I click on here, we'll see that go back to the original colours. That was a white trace on a blue background for every trace. Whereas if we take that tick off, we can set our own custom values, custom colours. I would suggest you always keep the background and the overall as black, as that gives a uniform black background to the whole screen. Just to show you what I mean, if I change the overall to maybe a cyan, then the overall background is now cyan and the individual trace backgrounds are black. But to make it look uniform, we want to keep this as black. Oops, that's not black. We'll set this as black. The foreground colour can be changed to anything you wish. So we can change this to a bright pink if we like. And it's very easy to change that and put it back to our green. There we are. The other option we have here is the line size, currently set to 1. But we can make those lines thicker if it improves readability. So we put it on 2, now the line is thicker, put it on 3 and it's thicker still. I don't think that's very attractive, so I'm going to put this back to 1. And I'm going to leave all my traces at 1. So the last thing to talk about in the ECG configuration panel is the synchronize tick box, which is actually ticked at the moment. What that means is that the ECG and the IBP traces, because they're both the same size on the screen, can be synchronized so that they always follow in line. So when you see a QRS complex, you'll see the associated IBP pulse wave below it. If you don't want to synchronize them, then you can take that synchronized tick box out. But we're going to leave them synchronized so we can see things as they happen in synchrony. We'll put that back in there. Okay, so that concludes the ECG setup. So we'll close that, and we'll now look at the IBP setup. Click on the IBP, and now we have the options that we had before in the trace options. We have the sweep speed, and we can see the trace moving across the screen at the same speed as the ECG, and we can change that. And note that because the synchronized tick box is selected, as I change the sweep speed for the IBP, I change the sweep speed for the ECG as well. If that tick box isn't ticked, I take that off there, then now my ECG proceeds at a different rate to the IBP. So set this up however you want it. Personally, I like to see them both synchronized, so I'm going to put that there and run them at 50. The sensitivity, much like the ECG, is for the millimeters of mercury per division. This is very insensitive, set at 60, and typically we'd be down at 20 or 30 for a normal pulse wave. We can shift the baseline if we wish, as you can see, using the shift button. Shift it back down again. So when you have an IBP pulse showing there, you can just use it to center it on the screen. Again, we have an option to select a beep on every IBP pulse detected. And one further option is to average the IBP measurement count. So it is possible, as here, where it's set at 1, that on every blood pressure pulse detected, it will calculate the systolic, diastolic and mean and update the screen. However, this leads to a generally erratic moving display, so it's probably better to average this over 8 pulses so that the average is well rounded and steady and gives you a good indication of the mean levels for all of those systolic, diastolic and mean values. Also here we have the 0 IBP. So the procedure is that you connect your IBP transducer, you set it up to be at the level of the horse's heart, and then you open the transducer to atmosphere and then click on the 0 IBP. Then the IBP values go to 0. 0 is complete. You switch your transducer back to monitoring the pulse pressure, and pulse pressure values start to show. There's one other option, and that's called Show Static IBP. And if we click this, you'll notice that up here, where we have 3 values for systolic, diastolic and mean, the mean being the biggest one, or the largest in terms of size on the screen, If we click on Show Static IBP Values, this changes to a single value. And now it represents the instantaneous value. So if you wanted to place a transducer with a catheter going into, say, bladder to measure static pressure of the bladder, or you wanted it in a venous line to measure the static pressure of the venous line, change to the static IBP values to allow that to be shown. We're just going to put this back to pulsatile, so it shows the pulsatile values, and that's it. That concludes everything in the trace elements for the IBP. And we now look at the alarms. All very similar to the ECG, but we have more options. So we can set alarms on heart rates as measured from the IBP. We can set values for alarms on high and low systolic values. We can set high and low mean values, and we can set high and low diastolic values. Probably the most useful ones would be the high and low mean values. We have a high value of 100 and a low of 55, for example. Now, whenever those limits are exceeded, the alarm will flash, and as shown here, it's flashing now because the values are 0, and an audible alarm will sound. We'll just take those off there now. In the colours option, we have exactly the same options we had with ECG. We can change the foreground colour. We can make this a nice blue colour. And we can change the line size. Okay. That's all the options for the IBP, so we're going to close that now. I'm going to look at the options for CO2. Click on the CO2 button, and this is beginning to become familiar. We can change the sweep speed, and here's the CO2 trace in the bottom right corner. We can change the CO2 trace speed, speed that up, make it go quite fast. We'll put it back to 12.5. Here are units 0 to 10%, 0 to 20% for the scale, and we can choose to look at that in percentage or millimeters of mercury or kilopascals. And you'll notice that the full scale values change as well when we change the units. We also have an option to show whether the CO2 trace is filled or just a line trace. I'm just going to put a few breaths into the CO2 line so we can see what that looks like on the screen. And if we change that to a line trace, we can see how the appearance changes. And this is obviously very much personal preference. My preference is to be filled, so I'm going to put that back to filled now. And again, here we have the sound option to beep on every breath. The alarms should become familiar now. The alarms allow us to have a high and low inspired CO2 and a high and low breathing rate. And we can enable those in the normal way. Set a high inspired value of, say, 1%, and then high and low expired values. And in colours, we have the same options as before. Okay, we're finished with that. I'm going to close that now. We're going to look at the one for airway pressure. Oh, before we do, I explain that the CO2 button is now flashing because we've got a period of apnea. Counting up here how many seconds since the last breath. If I click on this, it'll silence that alarm. But the period of apnea continues to count. The time for apnea, you may recall, is set up in the configure in the initial settings, where my apnea time is set at 40 seconds. That's why when I stopped breathing after showing the demonstration, after 40 seconds, the apnea alarm started to show. Okay, moving on to the airway pressure button. Click on the airway pressure button. Here we have similar options as before. We can change the trace speed for the airway pressure. We can actually make this quite fast, as you'll see in this trace here. We'll put that back to something quite slow. It's nice to have it slow on the airway pressure because it gives you the option to see several breaths at once. And the scale here is 0 to 30 centimeters of water, which is usable and required for probably most anaesthetics with horses. The alarms are similar. We have an alarm limit for the CPAP, so that if we put an alarm in here of 25%, if when we're running CPAP the value is exceeded by plus or minus 25%, then an alarm will show. And colours, much as before. We can change that colour, make that a nice red. Now airway pressure trace changes to red. We can close that. The next one to look at is the oxygen. Click on this oxygen. And here we have in the trace configuration panel the same things we've seen before, the sweep speed and the full scale percent. That's quite normal, and you've seen that before. Very briefly, we have some slightly different controls here. We have the V003. So if I click on V003 enable, what this does is add 2 extra buttons to the oxygen button itself. I have described this in a previous video, so I won't go into it here, but briefly we can set a fresh gas flow rate for our combined air and oxygen, and we can set an V003 fractional inspired value. And the machine will do all it can now to deliver 5 litres per minute total fresh gas flow at 60% oxygen levels. Okay, I'm going to go back into here and disable that. The final option below here is optional gas. This is for some custom machines that we've produced where other gases can be introduced and added to the mix. Again, if we go into the alarms button, we have alarms for high and low inspired oxygen, high and low expired oxygen, and alarms on the fractional inspired value and variations between the set value and what's actually measured. And again, we can change the colours of the oxygen trace, which isn't shown on the screen at the moment. Okay, and we can close that. The next one is SpO2. We have some limited options in the trace, basically to change the sweep speed of the pulse ox trace, which at the moment isn't shown on the screen, but it behaves in a similar manner. And we can make it beep on every pulse detected. The alarms are obviously, as you'd expect, high and low pulse rate and a saturation low value. And the colours can be changed as we discussed with all the other ones, follows the same pattern. Okay, the next one we're going to look at will be the agent, which is next to the SpO2. But as I can either go back, close this, go to agent, or I could, from where I was in my SpO2 button, I've just clicked on the agent, as these tabs are all available at the top. So in agent, we can change the sweep speed and the scale on the screen, and we can select which agent's in use. Now for older machines this is applicable, and I could change this to halothane if I was using halothane, or ISO, or SIVO, whichever I was using at the time. However, newer machines have agent identification. Even if you do change this to enfluorine, if it detects isoflurane, it'll change it automatically back to isoflurane. The alarms follow the same pattern. You can set high and low inspired and expired agent values, which will alarm, and the colour options are the same as the others. I close that. The last one that we're going to look at now is the nitrous button. So click on nitrous. If anybody's using nitrous, then we have the same options for the sweep speed and full scale, or changes in the full scale values between 0 and 50 or 0 and 100. Our alarm values are the same for high inspired or high expired values, and we can change the colour of the nitrous trace, which we'll look at shortly. I'm going to close that now, and it's just one thing to show you now, as we covered all of these buttons, is if we select maybe oxygen as an example, at the end we have the traces and trends, and this shows all the available traces and available trends that can be shown on the screen. The final button to look at is the temperature button. If I click here, it doesn't look like a normal button, but it is behaving like a button. We click on the temperature button and we open up the options for the temperature. We can choose between Fahrenheit and Celsius, and the time element refers to what we see on the screen as to how much history we have in terms of temperature when we display it as a trace. I'm going to cover this in another video regarding traces, so we're not going to go into it now. We have similar alarms. We have alarms for high and low T1, high and low T2, and high and low delta values. Delta being the difference between T1 and T2 of either polarity. So if we set a delta value for 10 degrees, that will alarm whether T1 is 10 degrees greater than T2 or T2 is 10 degrees greater than T1. Okay, we're going to take that off of there. And the alarm, the colours for the trace can be changed in the same way as all the others. The final buttons in the monitoring button sequence that we are to describe here are the ECG print, the phases, and the nitrous. We'll start with the nitrous oxide button because this is, to all intents and purposes, the same as the other ones. It's just that now nitrous is rarely used. We've made this a smaller button so we can fit more buttons on the screen. As you can see, in the nitrous, if we click on the nitrous button, we bring up the options for a sweep speed and a full scale deflection of 0 to 50 or 0 to 100%. And we have the alarms, high and low values of inspired and expired respectively, settable here. We set those in the normal way. So we set a high value for inspired of 60%, and we can set an expired high value too. And as before, we have the colours that can be changed for the trace, which at the moment isn't on the screen. I'm going to close that one. The next one I'm going to look at is phases. This isn't something that would be used by the normal user, more for research purposes or for advanced anesthesia users. But just to quickly show you the capabilities, phases allows us to import a file that was created elsewhere in a Tafonius phase editor, where you can design your own inspiratory profiles and ventilation profiles. And just to give you a flavour of what's this like, we're going to open up a file now. So let's click on Phases Start, and then we go to the Phases Picker, and I've got some preloaded ventilation files. I'm going to choose pressure ventilation, and I'm going to click on Single for a single use, and then click on Select. So there we go. And now you'll see that instead of push to ventilate, it says push to run phases down here on the ventilate button. Now my phases file that I've selected will simply run this piston by taking it to a PEEP or a CPAP of 5 centimeters and then 10 centimeters, hold it for 5 seconds, let it drop to 5 centimeters and then back to 0. So I'm going to push run. I'm going to push the run button now to run the phases. So we see it rise to 5, and we get this over here on the airway pressure, and then it goes up to 10, and then it drops back down to 5, and then down to 0. And it does that and now stops because we opt to run a single pass of the file. I can click it again to run it again. Okay, now if I stop that phases, we're now back to the normal ventilate button. So if I push it now, it's going to deliver a tidal volume of 6 litres in 2 seconds, which is a normal ventilation. If I go to phases again and choose pressure ventilation, this time select continuous and select. Now when I run it, it should continuously run that phases program. So we should see it alternating between a peep and a highest pressure of 10 and a low pressure of 5. 5, up to 10, drop to 5, up to 10, drop to 5, up to 10, drop to 5, and we see in our AP value, our airway pressure button, that we go between 10 and 5. And as before, I can press stop to stop the phases, and then it goes back to normal servo mode. I click on phases stop over here, it stops running the phase altogether. The last button to look at here is the ECG print button, which just prints an immediate trace of the ECG when you push it at any time. So I push it now, and stop. It printed for the whole duration of the time that the ECG print button was depressed. So while it's yellow, it's printing. There's one other thing we can do. If we go to the patient data and look at the view trends and look at this ECG history, we can see the ECG for the period that we've been recording our session. And we have some options in here to print that ECG. If we go to print, we can print 10, 20, 30 seconds from the start to the end, which is at this point 300 seconds maximum. And we can change our sweep speed that we print it on the paper and the sensitivity. So if we cancel here and we're going to select the last, we'll find a nice portion of it. So it's now going to start printing from this very left edge here. And we're going to print for 10 seconds from 1548.37. This is 1548.37.1. Just to show that again, if I move this to another representative area, just where that ECG starts, we're at 1547.04, go to print, and we're printing the ECG from 1547.04 for 10 seconds. I click on OK, it's going to print on the paper trace on the machine at a sweep speed of 25 millimeters per second at a sensitivity of 1 centimeter per millivolt. We're going to do that now. The ECG prints out. And now it's finished printing, we can close that. So this allows you to print the ECG either instantly using the button here, or retrospectively using the patient data and the view trends.